Hello, everyone. Hi, Carlotta.
Hi, Jocelyn. Hello, everyone.
I'll quickly share my screen before we get started. Awesome. So, welcome everyone to the concluding episode of Learn Live Tidy Fridays. Today, we will be covering Introduction to Clustering Models by using R and Tidy models. And we're really looking forward to walking you through the entire session. I am Jasleen, and I have with me Carlotta as my co host. Carlotta is a cloud advocate at Microsoft. She develops technical content around AI, ML, and Azure. This content is widely used by student developers and beginner learners, and she also oversees the R content on Microsoft Learn. Happy to have you here with me, Carlotta.
I'm happy to co-host this session with you, Jocelyn. Free to start, but first of all, thanks for the introduction of the session and of myself. So let me briefly introduce yourself as well to the audience. So Jocelyn is currently in her final year of the master's in data science. She's a gold Microsoft student ambassador and she's doing research in the applications of machine learning in agriculture. She's looking forward to graduating and making a career in data science, as I hope most of you in the audience as well. So, Jasmine, let's
Thank
let's
you.
start with our session today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carlotta. Before we move ahead and get started with the module, I would really quickly like to introduce our moderator for the day, Olan Rivaju. He is a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. You can find him on his socials as Twitter, as shown on the slide deck, and he will be managing all the streams and the chats. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them, and he'll make sure it reaches us. Okay, talking about the module that we're going to cover today, it's called Introduction to Clustering Models. So as you can see on the screen, there's a QR code. You can scan that and code right along with us while we walk you through the module. Also, there's the link, aka.ms/learnlive 202209223A. So Learn Live is basically a platform that helps you complete these exercises in an interactive manner, and you can simultaneously practice and apply your new skills. So you can either code along with us or go back to it once we're done with our module and try it out yourself. This brings us to the next slide, which Carlotta will be covering.
Yes, thanks, Jasleen. So let me briefly introduce the learning objectives for today's session. First of all, we will start with an introduction of what is clustering and which kind of use cases you will need to build a clustering model. Then we will experiment and evaluate different types of clustering methods. And finally, we're going to do an hands-on demo. Actually, we have two hands-on demo with you, training and evaluating clustering models in the tidymodels framework with our language.
Thank you, Carlotta. With that, I think I will introduce the module right now and then we'll take it forward. I hope you guys have fun and learn something productive today. So, we're going to start with talking about what is clustering. As the word suggests, I think most of us can guess it means a grouping of sorts. So, as you can see on the screen, it talks about grouping similar objects together. So, on the screen, we have a very simple example of 2D coordinates in three different colors. So, on the top right corner, we can see the blue cluster. On the top left one, we see the yellow cluster. And on the bottom right one, we see the red cluster. So as you can see that they are grouped with each other, but of course there's some science behind it. There's some reasoning why they are similar and why they are grouped together. So clustering is an example of unsupervised machine learning. What do we mean by that when we say it? So unsupervised machine learning is nothing but the model learning from data that does not have labels. So clustering comes into play. It's a lot like classification. You might get confused with it at point, but it's actually entirely different because we work with data that is unlabeled when we come to clustering. So clustering is one of the most basic methods that we actually use in unsupervised machine learning, and it actually helps us to segment data and try and help make a sense of the data. So a good example of application of clustering can be studying social networks, customer segmentation, spam filtering, and even brain connectivity. So a lot of places that require complex data to be grouped and to be analyzed, I think clustering is the way to go because it does the segmentation based on the similarity in the features. So we're going to deep dive into what these similarities are, how are they computed in the following slides. Coming to the next one, before we move on to what exactly the methods are, I would like Carlotta to come on screen and explain what is PCA. So PCA is an essential step before we go deep dive into clustering and its different types. So Carlotta, would you like to tell our audience what PCA is all about?
Of course. So in real life scenario, you'll find yourself working with quite big data set with n number of columns or features that you will use to build a machine learning model. In case of unsupervised learning, you can interpret these features as coordinates, describing each item's location of your dataset into an n-dimensional space. Now, an n-dimensional space is difficult to handle in a three-dimensional world, and in particular, it's even harder to visualize it in a two-dimensional plot, right? And that's why to better visualize the data and prepare the data for clustering, we could rely on a mathematical technique, which is called principal component analysis, to analyze the relationship between the features and to summarize each observation as coordinates for two principal components. So in other words, with PCA, we translate the n-dimensional feature values into two-dimensional and uncorrelated coordinates, which are able to explain most of the information and of the variability of our dataset, including the relationship between variables called correlation, which is the information we need to build clusters with similar items. Over to you again, Jasleen, to go into the details of the algorithms we are going to cover today.
Thanks, Carlotta. I think that was a very simple explanation of PCA that I think most of the audience could relate with. So moving on to the different types of clustering. So of course, there are a lot of methods to do this, but the two most best known ones are k-means clustering and hierarchical clustering. So they both do the same job, but the approach is slightly different in both the areas. And today for the session, I'll be talking about k-means clustering, and Carlotta will be walking you through hierarchical clustering. So starting with hierarchical clustering, and it's actually a more different approach than a k-means clustering, but I think k-means clustering is a better approach for any beginner out there. So as you can see on the screen, we have this graph that kind of shows you three different species of flowers. So obviously all the flowers bear certain similarities, and that is why there's this blue colored grouping that you can see being done on the video. So as a human being, of course, we can just look at it and say, okay, these are similar and these are not. But how does a machine do that? And how does a machine do that for a large amount of data? That's the question that we're going to be working with. And first things first, what is the K in K means clustering? So K is actually the number of clusters that we're going to get at the end of after performing K-means clustering. So the data scientist actually specifies the number K when we work with K-means clustering. So it's not like that you just run your data through the model and get clusters in the end. You actually have a say in deciding how many clusters you want the data to be segmented into. So this is obviously completely arbitrary. We cannot really ensure that the clusters that we are choosing are accurate. We have a different method for that, which we will be covering later on in the slide deck. So the first step of the algorithm is specifying the number of clusters to be created. So the data science does this. So over here, as we can see, we roughly see three different types of flower species. So we can say we want the number of clusters to be three. Moving on to the second step of the algorithm. So obviously the algorithm randomly selects k observations as the initial number of clusters. And the next step that comes with it is that the remaining observations have to be assigned to a particular cluster. So how does that happen? How does the model decide which element should be belonging to a particular cluster? So for k-means clustering to be completely successful, all the data points have to be assigned to a cluster by the end. So this brings us to the next step, which is assigning centroids to our k-means clustering model. So what are centroids? Centroids can be any point in these, any central point in all of the clusters that we're planning to create. And again, they're also selected arbitrarily. And as we go on into the algorithm, iteratively, we kind of adjust our centroids based on the information we keep gathering. So this actually brings us back to the point where I said this is a type of unsupervised machine learning. So of course, we can't tell the model this is what you're supposed to do or this is the label that you're supposed to look up, but obviously it learns along the way. So that is why it talks about being unsupervised. So obviously, the next step is the remaining observations. So talking about this, how do the remaining observations are assigned to a particular cluster? So in this case, we have flowers over here, and we have three centroids, as you can see on the screen. So this is basically done using Euclidean distance. So from the centroids, the distance of every single data point is calculated, and the one which has the shortest distance is grouped into that particular cluster. And the next step that happens is that we take an average of all the distances and then we come up with a new centroid. So the best centroid possible is the one that we are looking for. And we iteratively keep doing that unless we get all of the data points assigned to a particular cluster. So this is nothing but the expectation maximization algorithm. Some of you might be familiar with it. If not, you can always look it up after the session. So this is what we do. And so we have a certain observed values, which we are choosing arbitrarily, and the remaining of it is being understood on the way. So the next step of the is the new means of each cluster is computed, as I said, and the centroids are updated. Next, we have the cluster assignment and centroid steps are iteratively repeated until all the cluster assignments stop changing, that is, until we reach convergence. So by convergence, we mean that all the data points are successfully segmented out and assigned a particular cluster. So clearly, convergence is now achieved, and it is strongly recommended to have a good amount of, n start values. So I'll talk about n start a little later when we look at the code. So one good thing about k-means clustering, or maybe a confusing thing, is that every time you run it with a different n start value, you might get different outputs. So since it is unsupervised way of learning, that might happen. So you have to be a little mindful about the undesirable local points you don't want in your clusters. So you have to carefully choose the parameters that you pass into your functions on into your models. So now that you can clearly see, we recalculated and reassigned centroids a couple of times unless we got the desirable result. So typically the algorithm terminates when there is negligible movement in the centroids and the clusters become static, which is what we're looking at right now. So, coming back to what I started with, we randomly chose the number of clusters, which is k. So, the value of k was actually decided by the data scientist or the programmer, whoever is trying to run this k-means clustering model. But without knowing class neighbors, how do you know how many clusters to separate your data into? That's a very valid question if you would be working with k-means clustering. So how can we decide that that is what the data clusters are supposed to look like, or that is what the exact number of clusters we're supposed to have? So basically, this is done using the concept of within cluster sum of squares, in short WCSS. So basically what it does is it computes the sum of squares of different distances between each data point and the centroids. So every single time we do the reassignment of the centroids, we calculate the WCSS and we basically can get a graph that looks like this. So the graph basically tells us based on the total within sum of squares that how many clusters we should have. So clearly it is an elbow kind of graph, and from it we can roughly identify that 2 to 3 is the ideal number of clusters or the optimal number of clusters that our data should be segmented out into. So this is a great way to make sure that the assumption that we made in the beginning of having a particular number of clusters is verified or not. So WCSS is one of the methods that actually helps you decide whether the number of clusters that you have chosen for your k-means model are accurate or not. Moving on, WCSS again, we'll deep dive into how to calculate this when we look at the hands-on demo. But it's a good thing to know that WCSS is a confirmatory test kind of a thing that tells you that, okay, the number of clusters that you selected in the beginning is actually accurate. So to quickly sum up the algorithm in like 4 steps, the first step is picking up the number of clusters, which is k. Second is randomly generating centroids and then using a Euclidean distance, calculating the distance of the data points from the centroids. And then we keep iteratively assigning and reassigning the centroids and grouping all the data points one by one into their desired clusters. We keep doing that until convergence is achieved. By convergence, we mean that every single data point has been rightfully assigned to its particular cluster and the clusters become static. And the last thing is to verify whether the number of clusters that you decided in the beginning, which is k. So k does do the data points grouped together actually have high interclass similarity? WCSS is the answer. It actually verifies your hypothesis in the beginning that this is the number of clusters your data should have. So in this particular example, 2 to 3 was the correct assumption of having the number of clusters. So with this, I'll quickly switch over screens and walk you through the demo. So for the demo, as I already told you in the beginning, you guys can code along with us. So you can actually access 10 sandboxes on Learn Live and use them to study. And so with this model, if you want, you can actually code along with me and we'll see how we do. So go to the link that was shared in the beginning of the slide, look up the exercise, train and evaluate a clustering model, and feel free to code along with me. So before we go into what the clustering model is doing, I'd like to take a minute to talk about the data set that we are using. So the SEES dataset basically was published by the Institute of Agrophysics of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Lublin, and we can get it through the UCI machine learning repository. So that is the data that we would be using in this example and also the demo that Carlotta will be doing. So basically, it talks about different species of wheat seed. So with that, I would like to start with the demo. So first things first, we need to load the appropriate libraries that we need to actually run our k-means cluster. So the tidyverse library is actually really, really handy, and it is basically a group. It has a group of libraries like ggplot2, dplyr, tidyr, readr, parr, tibble, and even forcats. So all these libraries are grouped together in tidyverse, and with that, you can just about easily do any kind of clustering. So that is why tidymodels and tidyr are a really handy tool when it comes to making these models in R. So we're done with importing our library. The next thing that we do is we're loading the data set, and then we're trying to see the first 5 rows of the data set. So this is what basically our data set looks like. We have parameters like area, perimeter, compactness, etc. And we also have a categorical variable, which is species. So species has a numeric value, but we'll see how we deal with that a little later. Next, we are using the glimpse function, which is basically going to tell us about the data structure and the data types in the data set. So this is important before we actually decide to go ahead and do our k-means clustering on it. So a good thing about k-means clustering is that it can work really well on small data or large data, and it really adapts well to new data. So it's always a good start to actually familiarize yourself with the data that you're working with, and that is what the glimpse function here is helping us do. It is telling us about the different parameters, the rows and the columns. Next, the thing that we're doing is like I said, species has a numeric value, but species is not something that we can actually work with and feed into our model. So we're going to basically convert it into a factor variable or a categorical variable for to put it simply, and we'll be using it later for plotting purposes. So after doing that, and we are also working, so as we saw above here, we have a lot of columns. So for this k-means clustering, we're actually only be going to using 6 features out of our data set, and that is what we're actually doing. We are just segregating out the 6 features that we want to use, and then mutating the species column. And again, we're taking a look at our data set after the mutation. So this is what it looks like. Now you can clearly see we have 6 data points of features for every single observation of the seed species. Now, of course, we still have a 6 dimensional data. So how do we reduce the complexity of the data, reduce the dimension of the data, and then do the clustering part of the process? So as Carlotta already explained about PCA, so this is where PCA comes handy, and PCA actually comes and saves the day. So we have a 6 dimensional data space, and we have a lot of values, but we want to like we want to tone it down and we want to use it in a two-dimensional form, and we basically want to make our job easier, but also we don't want to lose the essence of the data. By the essence of the data, I mean the important parameters, the important information that the data contains. So that is where PCA comes in handy, and it is nothing but a dimension reduction method. But at the same time, it retains most of the important variation and the most of the important information of the data. So the importance of the information of the data is not lost when we do PCA. PCA actually helps us to see the most important components of our data. So before we apply PCA to any data set, it's always a good practice to normalize the data. So that is what we are doing here using tidy models. So first we are changing the species to a new role and calling it ID. And then we are actually using the normalize function to normalize our data set before we go for PCA. So the PCA recipe is ready over here, and comparing it to other things. So by updating the role of the species, you are basically instructing it to use it not as an outcome or a predictor. So obviously this is not supervised learning, this is unsupervised learning, as I already explained. So we do not need the species to be a target variable basically. So over here, we are basically trying to apply the PCA recipe that we created earlier, and the output of it is obviously PC1 and PC2. So we have successfully reduced it from a six-dimensional space to a two-dimensional space. Next, after doing that, we are actually calculating the PCA estimates. So it's basically telling you how much variance each component accounts for. So we have got two final principal components, and we are basically trying to plot it out in a graph and see which one has a total highest total variance. So as you can see, this graph is clearly very intuitive. It tells you the first component, of course, has the highest percent variance, then the second, and so on. So PCA is now successfully done, and as you can see, the first principal component successfully tells you about 72% of the variance of the six variables. So without losing a lot of important information, we were successful in reducing the dimension of the data after applying standardization to it, after normalizing the data, and then we basically got a cumulative variance of 89.11. So this is certainly very better, and it means that in layman words that the first two components were successful in summarizing the entire original six variables. So now that is done, we quickly plot our PC1 and PC2 and try to visualize the PC scores, and this is what the graph that we get looks like. Hopefully now we are very clear that two components are required why and what are the steps that we do before we actually go into the k-means part of the whole modeling. So obviously data pre-processing is a very essential step before we go into the modeling part. So it's always essential to make sure that the data is ready to be fed into the model and the data is actually prepped in the right way. So the metric, obviously, as I covered already, we will be the metric that we will be using to measure the tightness of the data, or basically what if our clustering is good enough or not, is within cluster sum of squares. And we can actually also plot WCSS for every single model. So for now, we will be using the built-in k-means function, which accepts data only in the numeric form. So we had also successfully mutated it, and we also just have numeric values right now in our data set. And we also scaled it down because it is always recommended that the data have the same scale. So all of that is done. Now all that is left is to feed it into our k-means model. So we will see how that works, but this is what our data actually looks like after all the pre-processing and the principal component analysis. Next, we will also look into the WCSS of different number of clusters. So we basically use the map function from the per package to apply the function in the element list. So over here, as you can see, the k cluster is having the table values of basically it's asking it to create 1 to 10 clusters. And within that, we have our centers assigned arbitrarily, and the n start value is 20. So n start over here is nothing but the parameter that helps decide the initial configurations, and it shuffles them up until we get the best possible one. So that is what n start does over here. And the model is obviously created. And before we go into the actual k-means part of it, we are going to use the WCSS concept and actually visualize how many clusters should our data set actually have. So using the ggplot library, we have passed our model, and we have also specified the WCSS formulas that we want to pass, that this is the method that we're going to go for. And we're basically plotting the total within cluster sum of squares. So this is what our graph finally looks like. And obviously from the looks of it, we can see it's a little off 2.5, so roughly a 3 and a 5 where the ridge is being created, but a further noticeable reduction is there from 2 to 3. So maybe 2 to 3 is the ideal answer that we are looking for, and is the ideal number of clusters that we are supposed to have for this particular data set. So the reduction is obviously less pronounced later on, and that is why we get an elbow at the end of the chart. So around 3 clusters is the assumption that we can clearly make from this WCSS plot. So this is a good indication that there are 2 to 3 reasonably well separated clusters in our data. So it's a good practice to actually do this before we dive into the actual modeling, so that we have a rough idea about how many K clusters we should actually assign to our model. So to sum it up, in this demo, in this workbook, you basically learned how to pre-process your data for a k-means clustering model, apply PCA to it, see the principal component analysis, see the principal components and their actual variation that they're showcasing based on the data that you have, and also in the end plotting the WCSS graph, which actually gives you an indication about how many number of clusters your data set can be actually segmented out into. So with that, I come to the end of this demo, and I would like to call Carlotta back, and she'll be taking you through hierarchical clustering and another really fun demo where you'll actually see how k-means actually works and the graph that we get in the end.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jasleen. I was on demo. I think that it was a very helpful walkthrough of how to preprocess data for k-means, and I will build upon this demo in a few moments. But first of all, I would like to take quickly one question from Nick Pinto from the audience. He is asking if these Microsoft Learning courses are free on the website. Yes, they are free. Now you can find them on Microsoft Learn using the link we shared in the chat. And you asked also about the certificate. So yes, there are some Azure certificate around data science, and since this Microsoft Learn module covers the fundamentals of machine learning, both supervised and supervised learning, of course, it could be very helpful to prepare for Azure certification around data science. Great. So with that said, I would like to go back to the decks and go ahead with experimenting with clustering methods. And I will cover now hierarchical clustering. So the first step in k-means clustering is, as Jasleen explained us, the data scientist specifying the number of clusters k to partition the observations into. While hierarchical clustering is an alternative approach which doesn't require the number of clusters to be defined in advance. Which is, of course, an advantage. In hierarchical clustering, the clusters themselves belong to a larger group, which belong to even larger groups, and so on, in a hierarchical scale. And the result is that data points can be clusters in different degrees of precision. So with a large number of very small and precise groups, or a small number of larger groups. For example, if we apply clustering to the meanings of words, we may get a group containing adjectives specific to emotions, like angry, happy, and so on, which itself belongs to a group containing all human-related adjectives, like handsome, young, happy, etc. And this belongs to even higher group containing all the adjectives in the English language, for example. So hierarchical clustering is useful for not only breaking down into groups our observations, but also understanding the relationships between these resulting groups. So a major advantage of hierarchical clustering is that, as we said, it doesn't require the number of clusters to be defined in advance. And it can sometimes provide more interpretable results than non-hierarchical approaches. While the major drawback is that these approaches can take much longer to compute than simpler approaches and sometimes are not suitable for big data sets. Hierarchical clustering creates clusters by either a divisive method or agglomerative method. The divisive method is a top-down approach, starting with the entire dataset and then finding partitions in a stepwise manner, while agglomerative clustering is a bottom-up approach. And in this session, we will work with agglomerative clustering, which is also commonly referred to AGNES, agglomerative nesting. And as Jasleen did for k-means, she kindly guided us through a step-by-step procedure for k-means algorithm. I would like to do a similar thing for hierarchical clustering, and in particular agglomerative clustering. So the agglomerative nesting algorithm includes five main steps. And the first one is the computation of the linkage distances between each of the data points. And these linkage distances make up a distance matrix as the one you see here in the deck. So this is the very first step. The second step is points that points are clustered in a pairwise manner with their neighbors. While the third step is that linkage distances between the clusters are computed. So this time we're going to compute the distance not between data points as we did for the distance matrix, but between the clusters themselves, the simple cluster with pairs we just built. And then the fourth step is clusters are combined pairwise into larger clusters to obtain bigger clusters. And then step 3 and 4 are repeated iteratively until all the data points converge into a single cluster. So by applying this step-by-step procedure, you will have seen that we also built an attractive tree-based representation to visualize hierarchical clusters, and this is called dendrogram. After the dendrogram has been constructed, you should slice this structure horizontally to identify the cluster formed. So here, the same question arose for k-means come back. So without knowing class labels, how we can know in how many clusters we should slice this dendrogram into? Likely the answer is the same. So you can use a data sample to create a series of hierarchical clustering models with an incrementing number of clusters. And then you can measure how tightly the data points are grouped within each cluster using the within cluster sum of square matrix that Jasleen talked about previously. We didn't need the k number of clusters at the beginning to start the procedure, to start the method, the agglomerative method, but we need it at the end to understand in how many clusters we should slice this dendrogram into. And by explaining how to apply hierarchical clustering algorithm, I talked about linkage distance between data points and clusters. But how this distance or dissimilarity between two clusters of observation can be measured? So we can compute this distance in a number of ways, but I will cover now three of the most common ones. We have the so-called complete or maximal linkage, which is one of the easiest one probably to understand because it uses the maximum distance between the members of the two clusters. So it takes into consideration the furthest points of the two clusters and then compute the distance between them. And it tends to produce clusters that are compact contours the border, but they are not necessarily compact inside. Secondly, we have the average linkage distance, the average linkage method, which uses the mean pairwise distance between the members of the two clusters, and it can vary in the compactness of the resulting clusters. And the third method I want to cover is the Worth minimum variance method, which is probably the most complex one of the three, but is also one of the most accurate because it's based on minimizing the total within cluster sum of squares from merging two clusters. So at each step, the pair of clusters with the smallest between cluster distance are merged. And this results in a tendency to produce more compact clusters. So that's why I said it tends to be more accurate. So all this method, of course, also includes the computation of the distance between data points. So going ahead, to calculate the distance between points, we have again a few methods we can use. For example, we have the Euclidean method, which is the most widely used, and this is only also the only metric for the word linkage method. We have the Manhattan method, and which has the property of being robust to outliers, and we have the cousin similarity, which is the only one which measures similarity instead of distance or dissimilarity. Great. So given this introduction about hierarchical clustering and in particular agglomerative clustering, I would like to build upon what Jasleen just showcased us um, on how to prepare data, our dataset for k-means. And I would like to go ahead and show you in practice how we can visualize the resulting clusters obtained for k-means, and also how we can compare k-means and hierarchical clusterings. In the first code chunk here, so here first of all, I am in the exercise unit 5 of the same learn module we pointed out at the beginning. So the one dedicated to clustering and our language. And this very first chunk, which is actually quite long, here we are just going to replicate a few steps that Jasleen showed us already step by step. We are going to load the libraries we need, so the tidyverse and the tidymodels. We are going to load the seeds dataset you already know from a CSV file. Then we are selecting the features of interest, which are all except groove length, so the first 6 features. And we are converting the species label, which is the class label pre-assigned in the dataset, into a factor for plotting purposes. But we have these labels in this dataset, but we are not going to use it for training purposes, because we are talking about unsupervised learning. And then we are going to specify, as Jasleen already showed us, we're going to specify 2 recipes, and we are going also to prepping and baking this recipe. So the first one binds 2 preprocessing step. It scales the numerical predictors, and it applies PCA to get 2 principal components able to explain the majority of information and variability of our dataset. And we are going to use this dataset to visualize the cluster assignments, because, as I said, for a 2-dimensional plot, we need a 2-dimensional dataset. And we are storing this dataset in a table called features 2D. While the other recipe we are specifying prepping and baking here is used to obtain data for clustering by removing the label column, the species columns. You see here the step remove species, since we are working with unsupervised learning, as I said, and again normalizing the numerical predictors. And we are storing this dataset into table, which we call seeds feature. I'd like just to recall here that a recipe in tidymodels is an object to bundle all the pre-processing steps we need to apply on our dataset before modeling, or in this case, before plotting them, for example. While the prep and the bake functions apply the specified pre-processing step to our data. And here we need 2 datasets, because the 2-dimensional dataset obtained with principal component analysis will be used for visualizing the cluster assignments into a 2-dimensional plot, while the features dataset containing the 6 numerical features, scaled and centered, will be used to build the actual clustering model. So with that said, let's move to model building itself, and let's start with k-means, because you already know this method. So Jocelyn guided us through visualizing the within cluster sum of squares for a series of k-means model, and we noticed a band at around k equal to 3 in the plot. And this means that k equal to 3 is the optimal number of clusters um, for our data set. So let's perform k-means clustering by specifying k equal to 3 as number of clusters. In R, you have already see it. To fit a k-means model, we can rely on the built-in k-means function, passing as input the training data set, which is 6 features in this case, which is a table with all the numeric columns. Then we pass the number of clusters we want to get as output, which is the centers parameters. Then we pass the number n start, which is the number of attempts of multiple initial random configurations before choosing the best one. In fact, the random starting point for the centroids means that rerunning the algorithm might result in slightly different clusters. So training usually involves multiple iterations whose max number is specified by this parameter, the iter.max parameter. And each time it reinitializes the centroids and the model with the best within cluster sum of square and the model with the best within cluster sum of square is selected at the end. Right after that, we use the verb augment to add cluster predictions to our dataset, which mean assigning a cluster to each data observation. And the final step is um, the final step is to visualize cluster assignments into a two-dimensional plot is binding the two principal components for each data observation in a way to have the cluster assignment for each pair of principal components. So that's why here we're using the bind calls verbs to bind to our dataset the features to the dataset. So the resulting dataset we are going to use for visualization is this one. We have the 6 features Jocelyn already showed to you. And then we have the cluster assignment. We have from the k-means, we have the encoded species, so the label, the classification label, and we have the two principal components. Great. So now to make the plot, so really actually visualize this data set into a plot, we are going to rely on ggplot2, which is a library we used throughout the whole series because in Tidyverse it enables us to create elegant plot. So the function ggplot initializes a plot for the results k-means data frame in this case. And the mapping argument is always paired with the IS parameter, the aesthetic parameters, and it specifies how variables in the data are mapped. And in this case, we want to visualize on the x-axis the first principal component, and on the y-axis the second principal component. So to this initialized plot, we then add incremental layers using the plus sign operator here to get our final plot. And in this case, we are using the geom point function. You see here geom point function to add a scatter plot, which is a kind of plot used to display the relationship between two continuous variables in the data set. In the aesthetic argument of the geom point function here, we specify that we wish to display a different shape for each cluster. So you see there's a shape equal to dot cluster here, which means that for each cluster assignments, we want to see a different shape. And then the final touch is using ggplotly to make the plot interactive. So let's see the result. The result is this scatter plot. As I said, we have 3 different shapes for the 3 different clusters. So a circle, a triangle, and a square. And so here we have the three clusters we wish it as a result, plotted in a two-dimensional plot. And why I said that this is an interactive plot, because you can play with it, for example, by removing the circle clusters and analyzing only the other two clusters, or you can remove two clusters, for example, and analyzing only the points of one cluster, etc. You can really interact with the plot to better understand the results. But now let's go a step further. So even if we are talking about unsupervised learning, we started with a labeled dataset, right? So we already had the labels of the species encoded into numbers. And so we already know the correct encoding for each seed in our dataset. And in this case, we can use, so since we have this ground truth, we can use these identifiers to compare the species classifications to the clusters identified by our k-means model, by displaying each observation with a different color, for example, based on the initial classification. So let's see how we can do that. So from the last code chunk, we just added color equal to species in a way that we are shaping the cluster. We are representing the cluster assignments as shapes, as different shapes, and the labels assignments, so the classification assignments with or ground truth, if you want to call it right like that, as different colors. And we are also specifying that as colors we want dark orange, purple, and cyan. So let's see the result. We have this time a colored plot, and we have you see we have three shapes for the free cluster assignment, again circles, triangles, and squares, and we have three different colors for the three different classes of species. So this allows us to compare the initial classification labels with the cluster assignments. And we can observe that there are a few differences between the cluster assignments and the class labels, of course. For example, here we can see that this observation has been assigned to the cluster square, but is classified as the circle observation. So it's classified as purple, talking with colors. However, we can say that the k-means model have done a reasonable job, because there are not a lot of these kind of differences. So that the seeds of the same species are generally speaking in the same cluster. So good job so far. Now we have we said that we want also to experiment with another type of clustering algorithm, which is the hierarchical clustering, or better, agglomerative hierarchical clustering. So let's go ahead with the next code chunk. And let's see how we can apply hierarchical clustering in R. So one of the methods we can use to fit a hierarchical clustering model is the function you see here, the hclust function. This function needs one input, a distance matrix structure computed by using distance matrix between all the observations, as produced by the dist function. So if you recall the distance matrix I showed to you in the DEX between all the data points in our data set, this is exactly what we are computing here with the dist function. And as measure of distance between cluster, we are as measure of distance between points, we are using the most common one, which is the Euclidean distance, as specified here in the method parameter. Now, the function hclust also allows you to specify the agglomeration method to be used to measure dissimilarity. Let's recall that we have three agglomerative methods. We have the world's minimum variance, we have the average linkage variance, we have the complete or maximal linkage distance. So for experimentation purposes, let's fit multiple hierarchical clustering models based on different agglomeration methods. And let's see how the choice in agglomeration method changes the clustering. So to perform, so you see here that we are building three models, one with complete linkage, one with average linkage, and one with word linkage method. But to compare, to perform this comparison between the three different agglomerative methods, the easiest way is visualizing them. And to do so, we can rely on the factoextra package in R, which provides the function fvids underscore dend here to visualize hierarchical clustering as dendrograms, the tree-based representation we saw again in the deck. So let's use this function to visualize the three hierarchical clustering, the resulting dendrograms of the three hierarchical clustering models. Here we have the complete linkage dendrogram. Then we have the dendrogram obtained by the average linkage agglomerative method. And as third option, we have the dendrogram obtained by the word linkage distance method. So what we can say here from this plot, and by looking at this plot, we can already notice that the dendrogram obtained by the word linkage method, so the third one, is the most balanced one. While regarding the complete linkage here, so the first one, we can tell that it has a more compact output, a more compacted cluster output with respect to the average linkage output here. Of course, this is something we are telling by just looking at the graph, so in an empirical manner. But to confirm what we are saying, there's also a mathematical metric we can compute, which is called agglomerative coefficient, called also AC, which measure the clustering structure of the dataset with values closer to 1, suggesting a more balanced and well-formed clustering structure, and values closer to 0, suggesting less well-formed clusters. So how we can compute this metric in R? We can compute this metric by using the Agnes function, from the cluster libraries. Um, so let's look at the result. We have the free matrix here for the free agglomerative method, and we can tell from the math, from the numbers, that numbers confirm what we empirically observe from the plot, because we have the word linkage method, which has produced a more balanced and well-formed set of clusters with the highest value for the AC metric. Then at the second place we have the complete agglomerative method with 0.93, and then at the third place we have the average agglomerative method with a value which is very close to 0.9, so it is still a quite high value. Great. So now that we have identified the best linkage method and we have built our dendrogram, we need to know in how many slices we should cut this dendrogram into. In fact, we say that it's true that with the hierarchical clustering, we don't need to start to produce our dendrogram or to build our model. We don't need the k number of clusters, but it's even true that we need it in order to slice our dendrogram into the optimal number of clusters we want to obtain. So in other words, we need to know which is the optimal number of clusters we should divide our observations into. So we have a ground truth. So we know that we have 3 species for our seeds dataset, but let's try to let's forget that we have this ground truth. Let's imagine that we don't know how many clusters we should have as output. Um, Similarly to what Jasleen did for k-means. So what did she do? She fitted the k-means model with incrementing number of k, and then she plotted the within cluster sum of square matrix for each model, obtaining an elbow graph. And she showed to you how to do all of these manually. using k-means functions to fit the models, and then the ggplot function to visualize them. However, I would like to show you that there is also a built-in function in R that does this for us behind the scenes. And this function is called fvids underscore nb classed. So it takes as input the training dataset of features, the seeds features dataset. Then it takes the clustering method. In this case, we are specifying hcat, which means we are using the hierarchical clustering. And then also the method to be used for estimating the optimal number of cluster, which is in our case the within cluster sum of squares. So let's look at the resulting plot. You can observe that it's really the same plot we saw for k-means. So the output optimal number of clusters is again the same. Um, uh, or in other words, the point of the plot in which we see an elbow is exactly 3. And this band indicates that additional clusters beyond the third have little value, and that there are 3 reasonably well separated clusters of data points that we can obtain. So now, to have a look to this splitting into 3 clusters, we can add to our dendrogram 3 colors denoting the slices we will cut it into. How we do that in R? We do that in R by using the fvids underscore den function again, but this time we are going to specify the number of clusters we want to extract, the number k, which is equal to 3. Um, and we are also specifying again word linkage, because we now know that this is the best agglomerative method for our data set. So here's the result. You can see now that our dendrogram is sliced into 3 reasonable clusters using 3 different colors. Great. So now we only have to actually cut the hierarchical clustering model into 3 clusters. So not only as a representation on our dendrogram, and then extract the cluster labels for each observation associated with a specified cut. So to do this, we can use in R the cut3 function. So this cut3 function takes as input the model, the seeds H classed word model, and then also the number k of cluster to extract, which is 3, as we just said. Also, as we did for k-means, we are also going to bind to the tables of the assignments the species columns here. So you see here the bind calls features to the in a way to bind the species column and the 2 principal component analysis for each data observation. So let's look at the resulting data set we will use for data visualization purposes. So we have the cluster ID assignment, then we have the species, the label of the species of the seed, and we have the 2 principal components. Here we are printing only the first 5 rows, just to show you how this dataset looks like. But of course, we have more than 5 rows here. So now what we can do, we have our hierarchical clustering model, we have our k-means model. We now want to compare the 2 models to see how they are assigning clusters to the same data set. How we can do this comparison? We can count the number of observation of each species in the corresponding clusters for the 2 methods. So here you see that we are going to count the number of points assigned for the number of points of a certain species assigned to a certain cluster. And then we are going to bind the results of the hierarchical clustering model to the results of the k-means model. So let's see the resulting table. Ignoring the cluster ID columns because they are arbitrary ID, we can see here that the observations were grouped quite similarly by the two algorithms. For example, let's take the zero, the species encoded, the seed species encoded with with zero. Hierarchical clustering assigned for this species 56 data points into the major cluster, and k-means assigned 62 data points into the corresponding cluster. The other few points you see here for in the other two rows um, are data points that were incorrectly assigned to the other two clusters. But the majority of the points were assigned by H clustering and k-means clustering to the major cluster, which represent the zero species, and the numbers are very similar. And the same applies for the other seed species. So now, if you want to visualize this better, you can also create a confusion matrix because, as I said, this is a particular example of use case of clustering, which we have a ground truth. So we already know the labels for each data points. Um, so we can rely on similar evaluation metrics as classification or in general as supervised learning. But I leave it to you for your own practice to create these confusion metrics. While for this demo, I would like to wrap up by making again another interactive plot that show how the observations were grouped into clusters with different shapes, again corresponding to different cluster assignments, and different colors corresponding to different classes of species. So again, we are going to create a a scatter plot using the geom_point function from the ggplot library. We are going to map to the axis the principal components. We are going to have three different shapes: the circle, the triangle, and the square for the three different cluster assignments, and three different colors, which we are going to specify here for the seeds label, so the ground truth labels. Let's see the result. You can see that it's very similar to the plot we printed before, we displayed before for k-means. Probably here we can see that there are a fewer number of differences between the cluster assignments and the ground truth labels. So probably these clustering assignments is a bit more accurate than k-means. But all of these can, I mean, can be better analyzed with something like a confusion matrix. So I encourage you to go ahead and continue this exercise on your own. While for now, I would wrap up the demo here and I would call back Jasleen because we have some questions for you. Right,
That
Jasleen?
was, yeah, Carlotta. I mean, I would really like to point out that the interactive visualizations were really fun. And I'm pretty sure our audience now has a good idea about when to use k-means, when to use hierarchical clustering, and what to do. So, with that, I think it's the right part of the session where we should take a quick knowledge check to see whether our audience is with us while we talk to them about clustering. So, with this, I would like to ask you the first question. But before I do that, I would also ask our audience to participate in the live poll. So I'm pretty sure the poll link would be shared in the chat, and you can even look up the poll using the QR code on the bottom left corner of the slide deck, or even at aka.ms/polls, and you can answer the knowledge check right here with us. We promise to give you enough time to answer. So the first question I would like to ask Carlotta is k-means clustering is an example of which kind of machine learning?
Yeah, so as you just mentioned, Jasleen, I encourage you all to participate to this game with us. So go ahead to the polls link you have in the chat, aka.mes/polls, and vote your favorite option here. So thanks for asking, Jasleen. We have three options here. We have unsupervised machine learning, we have supervised machine learning, and we have reinforcement learning. So I will give a few seconds more to our audience to answer, and then I will try to answer myself.
Hmm. I can already see some answers on the poll. I think that's great.
Yeah, so we have some people voting option A also in the chat.
Hmm. Hmm.
Cool. So let me start. I would start with option C to consider option C because probably we didn't mention reinforcement learning during the module. So I would like to um, briefly cover these. So reinforcement learning, similarly to deep learning, is a subfield of machine learning that learn autonomously. And it is called dynamically learning because it adjusts actions based on continuous human feedback. So the reinforcement learning wants to maximize a reward based on this feedback. And why we did not like mention reinforcement learning during this session, because clustering is not related to reinforcement learning. We don't have any reward mechanism in clustering. So I would start by exclude option C. Well, let me consider option A and B, so supervised and unsupervised machine learning. So here the terminology or the name, let's say, really help us, because when we think about supervised machine learning, we think about that we have a ground truth when we train our model. So we train our model based on a certain ground truth in a way that our model can learn and extract a function able to classify some items based on this function, some unlabeled and unknown data based on this function that it can extract from labeled dataset. So again, this is not the case of what we are covering in our session today. So clustering is not supervised machine learning because I mean, in our example, we had a particular dataset with labels, but we didn't use them for training purposes. We just used them for evaluation purposes. In general, for clustering, we don't need labels. So that's why I would go with option A, as a lot of people I can see in the chat and in the poll chose as option. So the correct option is A, unsupervised. Clustering is an example of unsupervised machine learning.
Great job. I think our audience was with us for the session and most of them got it right. So I think that's a
Yes.
win-win.
Yes, so thanks for voting, and clap to everyone who chose the good answer. So now let's go to question two. Again, remember that you can put your vote in the chat, or you can vote at the poll at aka.ms/polls. So this time it's my turn, Jasleen, to ask you the question. So the question is,
Mhm.
you are using the built-in k-means function in R to train a k-means clustering model that groups observation into three clusters. So very similar to what we did in the demo, right? So how should
Right.
you create the object of class k-means to specify that you want to obtain three clusters? So you have here
Mhm.
three options, and this three option, I see that what it changes is the input parameter. So we have three different input parameters. So which one you would choose?
Okay, so before giving away the answer, I think I'll let our audience guess for a bit and let's see if they get it right before I do. And with that, while they actually answer the poll, I would like to bring everyone's attention to the question. So the question is actually telling us everything we need to know. So, as the first line says, that it has to group the observation into three clusters. So, obviously, we know that the value that we are looking for is 3. Now, the next part of the question tells you how should you create the object of the class k-means to specify that you want to obtain 3 clusters. So I'll start from the first option and walk them through the different parameters, and let's see if everyone can guess what's the right answer. So the first one is n start equals to 3. So while I was talking about k-means, I think I did cover about iter.max, but we didn't talk a lot about n start. So what nstart does is it's basically a parameter which talks about what should be the initial, what are the multiple initial configurations our k-means model can have, and it then chooses the best one for us. So I don't think nstart would be the correct option here because that is not what we are aiming at. It's really good to have a good nstart value because then with that we can actually get the best possible values, best possible initial configuration for our k-means clustering model, but it definitely does not help us to decide the number of clusters. So option A is not the appropriate answer for this question. Moving on to the next one, I think I did talk about this in the session, but I'll quickly reiterate what I meant. So, item max. So, the name clearly suggests that it talks about the maximum number of iterations. But maximum number of iterations of what? That's the question here. So, it basically talks about the maximum number of iterations that can happen for the centroid assignment. So, if you can recall the algorithm, we computed the distances of all the data points several times, and based on that, we kept shifting our centroid. So that is what item max does. It talks about the maximum number of iterations it will take for the reassignment of the data points and the shifting of the centroid. Again, this would not help us to justify the number of clusters we want to segment our data into. So clearly the right answer over here is C, which says the centers equals to 3. So by centers, we are actually talking about the initial value k, which going back to the algorithm, the data scientist decides. So I think the right answer is k means centers equals to 3. What do you think, Carlotta? Am I right?
So I've seen that we had different people choosing different options in the chat and also in the poll. So we had a few people saying C,
Mm-hmm.
a few people saying B. So probably this was not so straightforward and easy, right? To
Right.
remember, but
Mm-hmm.
I think you guided us exactly through the right answer. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just see the right answer here for confirmation. So it's option C. Great job to everyone who answered C. Great job, Jasleen.
Mm-hmm.
This is all for our knowledge check today. So I don't see any question for now in the chat, but I encourage you all to ask for questions in the last few minutes we have together if you have any questions.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meantime, Jasleen, I let you go over the summary to wrap up the session.
Yeah, thanks, Carlotta. So, I am sure you all had a good, exciting time talking about the different types of clustering. So, to summarize, what we did in the session was we first started off with talking about what is clustering. We also deep dived a little bit into PCA. Why is it important? Why is it important to do it before clustering? And we also talked about the different types of clustering. So, k-means and hierarchical clustering, although they achieve the same goal, the approach for both of them is very different, and even the algorithm that they follow. So, that helped you to understand what the difference between the two of them is and what their evaluation metrics are. Finally, we also saw two hands-on demos, one for how to actually prepare the data, prepare the recipe for PCA, how to get your data ready to be fed into the model and to be fitted into the model, and also what is WCSS, which actually helped us in both the cases of clustering. So Carlotta guided us even wonderfully through the interactive plots that showed you the difference between k-means and hierarchical clustering. So with that, I think our knowledge check was also a pretty good success. Moving on, I think I would still like you to encourage you. So, if most of you did follow along with us, I'm really glad that you did. But if you didn't, and even if this session was able to capture your attention and intrigue you to learn more about clustering, we would like you to go to akia.ms/learn live and follow the link on the slide deck that you see. And you can even use the QR code to look up the Learn Live module on the Learn Live website. It's like Carlotta already mentions, it's completely free and it is a really great learning resource. You even get 10 sandboxes to use in a day. So the labs that we did with you, the hands-on demo that we did, you can actually retrace our steps, try to do it on your own, and I think then you'll be ready to build your own clustering models in no time. Over to you, Carlotta.
Great. Thank you so much, Jasleen. So, lastly, I would like to recall that this is the fourth and last, unfortunately, session of this series. So, today we covered unsupervised machine learning with clustering. But in the other sessions, if you want to rewatch the whole series, you will find useful content about classification, regression, and exploratory data analysis with R and tidymodels. So in this deck, you have both the link to rewatch the whole series and also an handy QR code you can use to navigate directly to the page in which you have all the modules linked and all the videos you can rewatch on demand when you would like. And as Jocelyn said, I really encourage you to go back to the Learn module and in particular the Learn sandboxes and practice yourself. So you have some pre-configured sandbox environment out of the box, so you can just code without thinking about pre-configuration or pre-installation, which is like a main thing when you need to do data science. So thank you so much, Jasleen, for joining me during this session. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today, and I I hope you will have a nice rest of your day, uh, and see you all for the next series, the next Learn Live series.
Thanks, Carlotta. Thanks, everyone. I hope you had as much fun as we had doing this session for you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.